This is The Creative Funding Show, a podcast for authors, YouTubers, and podcasters who want to fund the work they love without selling out.
Welcome to The Creative Funding Show. I'm Thomas Umstadt Jr., and with me is Mary DeMuth, who's an international speaker and podcaster. She's also a novelist, a nonfiction author, and many, many more things, but I don't want to give away too much of her story. I want to let her tell it. She lives in Texas with her husband of 28 years and is the mom of 3 adult children. Mary, welcome to The Creative Funding Show.
So glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So how did you get started writing?
Well, I've always kind of been writing my whole life, but in terms of a career as a writer, once I had my first child, I had this like compelling need to be published, and not in a a grandiose way, like I need to validate my existence by being published, but just like I had this so much inside of me that I needed to get out and to share it with folks that I wanted to help people, especially just heal from trauma and stuff like that. So I spent about 10 years in the 90s and just writing. And things didn't really take off for me until kind of the mid 2000s, where that's where I landed an agent. I had a newspaper column. I was just working on my craft. And starting about 2005, I've been writing, for the most part, 3 books a year for about 13 years now.
Very nice. So you started off the traditional way, and of your traditional books, the one that's my favorite is Thin Places. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, when people ask me what my favorite book is, that's the one I'll say as well. And that's my memoir, which was a really hard book to write. It basically tells a story of my upbringing, and anyone who's had a hard upbringing and knows that their family members are still alive that are involved in the story, you would know that it's not an easy thing to do, because you could risk relationship and all of that. But I really felt like it was time for me to write the story. I'd finally started to share it publicly, verbally as a speaker. And I knew that there was power in telling a story so that other people could say, oh, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that was neglected or abused or experienced sexual abuse or death of a parent or divorce of my parents or drug abuse in the home. Those were just some of the things that I had experienced when I was a little kid.
Yeah. And so you write this book about your journey of overcoming sexual abuse or being a survivor of sexual abuse and the healing that you had. And I'm not ashamed to admit, I cried at least once while reading the book. It's very, very powerful. And what was the reaction? Did readers ask you to write a follow-up book?
They did, but they were more interested in seeing more of the process, because Thin Places is a memoir. So my goal in writing that book was simply storytelling. And there's things you can take away from that book in terms of, for your own healing journey or feeling validated and all of that. But folks wanted to know, okay, how do I heal from sexual abuse? What does that process look like? And so I started mulling that over in my mind, and that's where the book, I also wrote a viral post for, I think it was Christianity Today or another entity that was about, I think it was called, I'm sick of hearing about your smoking hot wife. And what I meant by that is that, I was frustrated when I was sitting in the pew and I was hearing about how wives are always supposed to be sexually available to their husbands. And I realized, looking around the room, that there were probably 40 to 50% of the women in the room had been sexually abused. And so for them to do that, there was a lot of hurdles to get over. And so I was tired of this kind of shame being heaped on victims of, you're not doing enough, you should do more. And when they just don't even have the capacity. And so from that, it gave me this desire to write a book, which ended up becoming Not Marked. And that kind of absolutely started my journey in crowdfunding.
So you are successfully traditionally published. You've done a lot of books. You have an agent. You wrote a viral blog post. So I bet traditional publishers are falling all over themselves to publish this book, right?
Well, maybe if it had happened in the Me Too era, but not then. And I did pitch it to several of my publishers. I've had different publishers throughout the years, and all of them were like, they didn't say it this way, but basically, we won't touch that with a 10-foot pole. And one of them actually did say, we don't believe there's an audience for this book. And I was so frustrated. Wow. I was like, you mean almost half of the people in the world have experienced this and you think there's no market for it? Okay, well, let me just do this on my own then.
Which, if this had happened 20 years ago, that would have been the end of the story. Like there's like, okay, well, you win, people in the suits who are out of touch with humanity. But that's not what happened. What happened next?
So I called my friend, his name's Thomas Umstadt, and
I do know this story.
You know this story. You're baiting me. No, I called you, or we talked, and I knew that you had done crowdfunding, and I think it was your suggestion, and you and I mutually belong to a mastermind group. It was through that we all kind of figured out that it would be important to crowdfund this. And I was like, I don't want to do that. I hate asking for money, totally hate it. And you know this because you had to hit me over the head a couple times. But I consulted with you because you'd had a successful campaign, and our initial goal was $10,000, which would cause me to be able to pay for the editing, the cover, and the print run of 5,000 copies.
And we put it on Kickstarter because that's what I recommended.
Right.
And Kickstarter rejected you too.
Yes. I was like, whatever. Everyone's rejecting me. At the time, and I don't know if Kickstarter is still this way, but at the time they wouldn't do self-help books, and they perceived that, which it was, a self-help book. So we jumped over to Indiegogo. I just kind of took all the HTML from that page and pasted it into Indiegogo. They said, yeah. And we did a do or die campaign, meaning if it didn't raise in a month, then it didn't raise at all. And because I think that's really important in terms of having that immediacy for people. Like they're going to get behind it, because if it doesn't fund, it doesn't fund.
That's right. Indiegogo is like the laid back younger brother, actually older brother of Kickstarter. Kickstarter is super uptight. They have relaxed some of their rules since then. So you could have put your book on Kickstarter now, but it's much harder to get your campaign approved on Kickstarter than it is on Indiegogo. Indiegogo is like, yeah, whatever, dude. You want to fund your book? That's fine. You have an audience. Kickstarter's like, wah!
It's true. It's true.
So you launched the campaign, and we worked together on figuring out rewards that would work. And you launch it. So what happened kind of in that first week of you having your Indiegogo campaign live?
Besides my practical nervous breakdown, it went very well. And I believe it was in just a few days. Of course, you know me, Thomas, I'm not really good at looking at stats, but it was within a few days that it funded to the $10,000 level.
Take that, publishers.
Yeah,
you say there's no audience for a book about recovering from sexual abuse. You just missed out.
I know, right? And so then we had already predetermined stretch goal levels. So it wasn't like this took us by surprise. We were hoping to get that. But I don't think either of us knew we would get it so quickly. So then we rolled out our stretch goals, some of which included, I think, a study guide for the book to be created. And the big one, the big kahuna at 25,000 was an audio book produced. And that actually does cost a lot of money to do. And so, when it was all said and done, we ended up with over 25,000, just a little bit over. And I was able to go ahead and do the audiobook. And honestly, had I thought about it further, I might have tried for maybe some more, because I didn't really personally make any money off of this. I poured all $25,000 back into the project, which is great, which is what it should be. But I certainly wasn't remunerated for my time or anything like that. But that's fine. I mean, this is a ministry, so I was happy just to get it funded.
And you went with offset printing instead of print on demand. And I feel like that's an important thing to explain. What's the difference between those two, advantages and disadvantages?
Right. So, people would ask the question, well, why don't you just put it up on CreateSpace and then it's print on demand? It doesn't cost you anything. And the reason we went with offset printing is if I had put it on CreateSpace, the cost for me to buy my own book was like $6 or $7. And if I wanted to be able to donate it to a ministry, which I continue to do to this day, I would have to absorb that cost. And so if I did a print run, and I actually have a friend that has a warehouse that ships for me, which helped tremendously in the process and helped the decision. But if I did a print run, then it reduced down to $1 a copy. And so, that's what we did, because now for me to donate 500 books besides shipping, it's $500. And that's so much cheaper than, 6 times that amount.
That's right. So you can send a women's shelter a box of books, and it's not this bank breaking event.
Right. And, I just did this like 2 weekends ago. I sent 2 cases to a church that I spoke at and just gave them away. And, that's my heart in this book is I want people to understand they're not alone. I want them to walk the healing journey. And the most unique part of the book is that my husband wrote part of it. So I am a sexual abuse survivor. He is not, and how he had to kind of learn what it's like to live with a sexual abuse survivor and how to help and what didn't help. And so anyone who's been like frustrated or confused and they're trying to help their friend who's walked through this, it's a really good book for them too.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit what's happened after that. So once you got the taste of crowdfunding,
then I ran away. No.
Like maybe this whole traditional publishing thing, maybe not as great as everyone says it is. So what are you making? What are you creating currently?
Currently, I'm weirdly creating art. So I'm creating pieces of art that came about, and this is kind of an interesting thing for your listeners, is pay attention to your audience. So I, during the Lent season, was creating art every day, and I did it for like 4 or 5 years. And every single time I did it, which I thought it was ridiculous and funny, but people would ask, would you please sell your art online? And I was like, that's dumb. But this year I finally listened to my audience and I've started selling that on Etsy. And so just another platform that allows you to sell something that's creative, not the same as crowdfunding, but another avenue of income stream. And the takeaway from that is listen to your audience, because if they want something from you, then you can give it to it. It's the same with Not Marked. I listened to my audience. They wanted that book and I gave it to them.
I think that's a really powerful principle. And it's a really powerful principle when you're putting together rewards, whether it's for an Indiegogo campaign or a Patreon campaign. The best rewards are what your audience is already asking for. So sometimes you're like, oh, I should do this thing that's a whole lot of work. And your audience is like, we don't really care about that. And this other thing that's really easy for you to do. And you're like, why would anyone want that? People are like, oh my gosh, give me more, give me more. And you have to, there's this thing called the curse of knowledge, where we don't know what we don't know, or what it's like to not know what we know. It's the math teacher problem. They've been teaching the same math class for 30 years. It's so obvious to them. And the student, the freshman in the class, like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And it can be that same way with our backer sometimes.
It's true. And also I'm, to answer your question a little more fully, the other thing I'm doing right now is I'm podcasting. And initially I was doing a show called The Restory Show, and I've done that for several years, and that's beginning to wind down. And that was a interview show where people were telling their restories, meaning they had this one story, it was terrible, things went wrong, and then there was a shift and there was a restory. Now I'm doing a podcast called Pray Every Day, where I walk people through verse by verse a particular book of the Bible or chapter of the Bible, and then I pray for 5 minutes for people. And that's now currently on a Patreon campaign, and I am funding that. I'm funding the editing that way, or at least partially funding the editing that way. And that's a pretty new thing for me to do, Patreon. And it's been an interesting process. I'm surprised any humans are backing it. I'm grateful, and it is a big help.
Yeah. So walk us through your Patreon rewards. Tell us a little bit about your Patreon campaign.
Yeah. So to me, it's been trying to figure that out, because I wasn't really sure what to give people, but it kind of correlates with my art as well, as people kept asking me for it. So I said, okay, well, if you support me at a $5 or more level, then you'll get an original piece of art digitally. I'm not going to send it to everybody like in the mail, because that would just drive me crazy. But digitally, I'll send them an original piece. And so that's one of them. Another is when you get to the $20 level, you receive a free audio of me every month that nobody else gets. It's nowhere, anywhere on in the world. And so they are able to do that. The next thing I'm considering, and Thomas and I have talked about this, is to create a $10 level, which would be, would you like your name on my website on the post for Pray Every Day? And this goes up 365 days a year. So if you back at that level, then your name is going to be on every blog post that goes up that advertises Pray Every Day.
This is one of those really easy things for you to do that people get very excited about. And you'll notice that there's nothing new about this idea of putting people's names on things. Universities have been doing this for centuries. They're like, give us $1 million and we'll name a building after you. Give us $1,000 and we'll put your name on a brick. And like you go to a university and like there are thousands of bricks and they have different people's names on them. You go to a bench, there's a name on the bench, and like everything that could be possibly is named. It's named and it's paid for. And it's funny because sometimes I go to a university and it'll have some generic name for a building. And I'm like, oh, it's a your name here, please sponsor.
Yes, this is a sponsored,
it's like
needing to be sponsored.
I'm like, oh yeah, this will totally be the Oak Room 10 years from now. It'll be named after somebody.
It'll be the Umstadt Room.
Yeah, there you go. I'll become a big patron. So I love how you're doing this and you're able to connect with a core group of patrons who, in a sense, have pivoted, right? You've pivoted from one podcast to another podcast, or you're in the process of doing that. Have you gotten any pushback from your patrons on that?
I thought I would, but I got zero. And, I had changed what the page looks like, and I did a new video and all of that. And it stayed the same. And actually more people got it on board. And I think part of that reason is because, I've been talking about it on the podcast about every 7 or 8, maybe 10 episodes. I'll say, hey, be a Patreon sponsor. Because since it's a daily podcast, I don't want to be like, hey, do this. But as we were talking, I just got a great idea. I thought, I'm going to create a graphic for my site for each post, which has bricks on it and names. So every time someone subscribes to that $10 level, I'm going to etch their name into a brick, and that will upload again to the page. So I thought that would be kind of fun.
Yeah, there you go. And this is an important point because people ultimately are they're backing your art, but even more so, they're backing you. And whether you're creating, a podcast where you're interviewing people, you're creating a podcast where you're praying every day, it's still the sort of thing that's very consistent with your brand and very consistent with what they're expecting from you. And they're not like, oh, I'm going to stop backing you because you've made this pivot, or at least the core audience that you have so far, none of them have made that decision. And I think this is an important point because people can be paralyzed to change. Like, oh my goodness, I'm having this success here. If I change what I'm doing, I'll lose all my fans. I'll have to start over from scratch. And that's not necessarily true.
No, and you need to follow your joy as well. And, I've had a tremendous amount of joy doing the Restory show. And over the past couple months, for whatever reason, the joy just drained from me and it became a drill instead of a joy. I was like, oh, I've got to do this again. And I just, for whatever reason, I can't even really explain it. But when I started the Pray Every Day show, I was like, this is really what I need to be doing. I love this and it's very fun. And so, yeah, I also shifted the way in which I viewed the patronage of that show versus Restory. So the Restory patronage was like, let's get these stories out there. Let's hear these amazing stories. This one is, let's get these prayers to the end of the world. And so it's kind of almost a wider goal of, you being a sponsor helps us get this all over the place, which is really cool. Like one of the things that we did was I was able to pay someone to get it up on Alexa Skills on the Amazon Echo. And that has been one of the greatest sources of traffic for the podcast.
Yeah. Pro tip, the Echo platform, the smart speaker platform, is growing faster than the smartphone platform grew. People are adopting it faster than they adopted iPhones back in the day. So if you're a podcaster, if you're a YouTuber, if you're an author, whatever you're doing, you need to start thinking, how does what I create, how can that be manifested on an Echo? And I encourage you, get an Echo, go buy the $30 Dot just so you can understand this revolution. Because if you don't have one, it's really hard to understand what they are, because it's not like a phone, it's not like a television, it's not like a radio, and yet it is kind of like all of those things.
Right.
So what advice do you have for somebody who's thinking about writing a book and they're not sure where the money's going to come from? They're thinking about Kickstarter, they're thinking about Patreon, they're thinking about Indiegogo. What advice do you have?
Well, for a book, it makes more sense to me to do a larger platform, like Indiegogo or Kickstarter, where it's just a one and done. You get your $5,000, $10,000, $15,000. And then you make your book. My friend Erin Kincaid is currently funding a children's book, which is going to have amazing illustrations. And that's going to get funded. I know it will be funded. And it's a one and done. It's a $5,000 one. And now she'll be able to have this book created. So that's what I would advise. If you're doing something ongoing artistically, like a podcast, then I would say jump onto Patreon, sponsor a few people. Like I sponsor one of Thomas's, the novel marketing podcast. I sponsor that and just kind of go through the process of what it's like to be a sponsor and look at a lot of pages and begin to see what people really love to do. And, what are the ones that get the most? And I think that's super helpful to just get your own intelligence and find out what works.
Yeah, I think the best way to learn these platforms is to just spend $10 a month patronizing 10 different campaigns, or go on Kickstarter and spend $20 and just $1 per campaign, because you learn just as much giving $1 as you do giving $20 actually buying the thing. And what's interesting is that all of these platforms allow you to give $1 and get no reward, because the reward you're getting is not the board game that you're backing on Kickstarter. It's all of the updates and seeing what they're doing and the changes they make. Because when you go to a page that's funded, you see the final version of that page. You don't see the beginning and the middle and the end and how it's adapted and the changes and the struggles and I got a lot of feedback about this, and so I'm making this change. Like all of that journey you can observe and get access to if you're a patron or if you're a backer. And it's a very inexpensive way to learn how to do it well. There's a correlation on Kickstarter of how, and I've mentioned this before on the show, the more campaigns a creator has backed on Kickstarter, the higher their success rate. So for people who've backed one campaign, their success rate is 16%. For people who've backed over 50 campaigns, their success rate is over 60%. So you have 6 times more likelihood of succeeding. 600% success rate goes up if you back 50 campaigns first, just because of all of the learning and the understanding that goes on during that process.
Yeah. And if you don't have that kind of time, then hire someone like Thomas to help you, because that's I came into it really naive and not knowing anything. And I knew that I needed to have someone who understood it better than me to walk me through it. And then we were very successful. So that's my other bit of advice, is if you're time strapped, and you can hire them by either giving them a cash reward or give them a percentage of what comes in. And that way you don't have to have cash up front. So that's also another way you can have your intel, is to use someone or, be mentored by someone who already knows how to do it.
That's right. All right. So Mary, where can people find out more about you?
Well, everything's at marydemuth.com. And the podcast that we've been talking about today is prayeveryday.show. And thanks so much for having me on. And yeah, you can find me all over the internet and in crazy places and little corners of the internet, but mostly marydemuth.com.
There you go. I'll have links to her website and her Patreon and all the other things in the show notes. If you just scroll down in your podcasting app, you can tap to go to those pages. And Mary, thank you so much for coming on the Creative Funding Show.
Thanks. It's been my pleasure.